What is the most tragic event that most people have never heard of? Story 1 on January 23, 1556. An earthquake struck Shaanxi province in central China in the early hours of the morning. The official death toll is approximately 830,000 people, a number that makes it not just the deadliest earthquake ever recorded, but one of the deadliest single events in human history. To put it in context, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, which shocked the world and generated massive international humanitarian response, ended approximately 160,000 people. The Shaanxi earthquake ended 5 times that many. The specific reason the death toll was so catastrophic is worth knowing. The region of Shaanxi and neighboring provinces in the 16th century had a distinctive housing tradition. People carved their homes directly into the lowest cliffs, the soft, compacted soil deposits that blanket much of north-central China. These Yaodong cave dwellings were practical and insulating, cheap to construct, and suitable for the local climate. They were also catastrophically vulnerable to seismic activity. When the earthquake struck, estimated at approximately magnitude 8, the lowest cliffs collapsed instantly, and hundreds of thousands of people were buried in the caves they were sleeping in. Contemporary accounts describe the disaster in terms that remain striking: mountains crumbling, rivers reversing course, the earth opening in some places and rising in others. The earthquake was felt across an enormous area, but the concentrated population in the cave-dwelling regions of Shaanxi, and Henan suffered the overwhelming majority of casualties. The 1556 Shaanxi earthquake does not appear in most Western history curricula. It barely appears in popular disaster lists. If you asked a well-read person to name the deadliest earthquake in history, they'd probably say somewhere: San Francisco, maybe, or Lisbon. The answer is a Chinese province in the year 1556, and the number is 830,000. Story 2: between June and August of 1931, the Yangtze River, the Huai River, and the Yellow River all flooded simultaneously. An overlap of catastrophic events driven by a winter of unusually heavy snowfall, followed by spring and summer storms. The resulting inundation covered an area roughly the size of England, displacing tens of millions of people. The estimated death toll ranges from approximately 1 million to 4 million, depending on the methodology and whether subsequent famine and disease deaths are included. Even the low estimate makes it the deadliest natural disaster in recorded history. 1 million people died in the initial flooding. Then the problems compounded. Fields were underwater. The rice and grain crops were destroyed. Water sources were contaminated. Cholera, typhus, and other waterborne diseases followed. Famine followed the disease. The cascading consequences of a few weeks of flooding in the summer of 1931 played out across the following year in ways that multiplied the original death toll. International awareness was limited. China in 1931 was a country in political crisis. The nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was fighting both communist forces and ongoing Japanese incursion into Manchuria. The floods added a humanitarian catastrophe to an already catastrophic political situation. Western newspapers covered it, but not at the scale that an equivalent disaster in a European or American city would have generated. The 1931 floods are the biggest natural disaster most people have never heard of. Not just big, the biggest. It is not a close competition. Nothing in recorded history ended as many people as quickly as the overlapping floods of the Yangtze Basin in the summer of 1931. The number 3 million is probably in the right range. It is a number that doesn't appear in the popular disaster mythology that most of us were taught in school. Story 3: the 1970 Bola cyclone. 500,000 people died in one storm, and it helped start a war on November 12, 1970. The Bola cyclone made landfall on what was then East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. The storm surge it produced reached up to 10 meters in some coastal areas, inundating a low-lying delta region where millions of people lived in close proximity to the sea. The official death toll is approximately 300,000 to 500,000 people, making the Bola cyclone the deadliest tropical cyclone ever recorded. In a single night, a storm ended nearly as many people as the entire United States death toll in World War II. The political response to the disaster is as important as the disaster itself. East Pakistan was administered from West Pakistan, separated by over 1,000 miles of India. The West Pakistani government of President Yahya Khan responded to the cyclone slowly and inadequately. Relief supplies were late, insufficient, and poorly distributed. East Pakistanis, who had already been experiencing tensions with the Western government over cultural and political representation, experienced the inadequate cyclone response as evidence of deliberate neglect. The general election held in December 1970, a month after the cyclone, produced a massive victory for the Awami League, the East Pakistani party, which won enough seats to form a government. The West Pakistani military refused to accept this outcome. In March 1971, the Pakistani military launched a brutal crackdown in East Pakistan, triggering the Bangladesh Liberation War. India intervened militarily in December 1971. By December 16, 1971, Bangladesh was an independent country. A single cyclone that ended 500,000 people contributed directly to the birth of a nation of 170 million people. The connection between the Bola cyclone and the independence of Bangladesh is direct, documented, and almost entirely absent from how either the cyclone or Bangladesh's history is taught internationally. Story 4. On the night of August 21, 1986, Lake Nyos in northwestern Cameroon released approximately 1.6 million tons of carbon dioxide in what is called a limnic eruption, a sudden, catastrophic degassing of a volcanic lake that had been supersaturated with CO2 dissolved from the magma below. The gas cloud, heavier than air, rolled down the valleys surrounding the lake, silently displacing oxygen as it moved, at speeds estimated between 20 and 50 kilometers per hour. People in the villages of Nyos, Cha, Phong, and other nearby settlements died in their sleep, or while working outdoors, or while walking, dying within seconds of breathing air that had been replaced by CO2. Livestock died alongside them. Insects died. The gas cloud was dense enough and moved far enough to affect settlements up to 25 kilometers from the lake. The survivors who reached affected villages the next morning found something that no one had seen before or since. 1. 700 people dead without any visible cause of death, without any fire, explosion, disease, or violence. People slumped in their houses, on their porches, on the roads, bodies of cattle scattered across fields. A few survivors reported smelling something slightly unusual before losing consciousness. Most reported nothing at all before waking to find everyone else dead. Carbon dioxide, at the concentrations the Nyos cloud produced, is simply not detectable by human senses at toxic levels. You cannot smell it, taste it, or see it. It simply replaces the air you're breathing with a gas that doesn't support life. By the time the body's CO2 receptor triggers the urge to breathe harder, the surrounding air is already unbreathable. Lake Nyos has since had degassing equipment installed to slowly and safely release its CO2 reserves. The lake is still there. It is still slowly recharging. Story 5. On September 8, 1900, a powerful hurricane made landfall on Galveston Island, Texas. Galveston at the time was not a backwater. It was the 4th largest city in Texas, and a major Gulf port, wealthy and cosmopolitan, connected to the mainland by a railroad bridge. The city had been warned of approaching storms by the Weather Bureau. The warnings were not taken with the seriousness that would have prompted mass evacuation. The storm surge that arrived with the hurricane was between 4 and 6 meters high. Galveston Island, at its highest point, was approximately 2.7 meters above sea level. The storm surge was higher than the entire island. The island did not flood. It was submerged. Buildings were swept off their foundations by water and by debris that became battering rams. Thousands of people who tried to shelter in substantial brick buildings found those buildings collapsing under the hydraulic pressure of moving water and debris. The estimated death toll is between 6,000 and 12,000 people. In a city of approximately 42,000, between 14% and 29% of Galveston's population was ended in a single night. The 6,000 low-end estimate would still make it the deadliest single natural disaster in American history by a wide margin. The potential 12,000 high-end estimate would make it approximately as deadly as the September 11 attacks. Galveston responded by building a seawall 5 meters high and 16 kilometers long, and by raising the entire island, pumping sand and fill under existing structures to lift the ground level. This was an extraordinary engineering project that essentially rebuilt the city's foundation. The 1900 hurricane is barely taught in American schools outside Texas. The deadliest disaster in the country's history is, for most Americans, entirely unknown. Story 6: The Peshtigo Fire. On the same night as the Great Chicago Fire, a Wisconsin blaze ended 10 times more people. Everyone learns about the Great Chicago Fire of October 10, 1871. The legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow. The rebuilt city. The photographs of the ruins. It's one of the most famous disasters in American history, which is interesting given that it ended approximately 300 people. On the same night, October 8, 1871, the same Sunday, a fire was burning in and around Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and the surrounding Green Bay region. This fire ended between 1,500 and 2,500 people. It was the deadliest fire in American history. It happened on the same night as the famous Chicago Fire. Almost no one has heard of it. The Peshtigo Fire was not a city fire. It was a wildfire of almost incomprehensible scale. Drought conditions across the upper Midwest had made the forests and prairies tinder dry. Strong winds on the night of October 8th spread multiple small fires into a single catastrophic firestorm. The town of Peshtigo itself was destroyed in minutes. A firestorm of this scale generates its own wind system, and the fire moved faster than people could run. Witnesses described walls of fire, burning embers raining from the sky, people jumping into the Peshtigo River to escape flames that burned on the water's surface from flammable debris. The reason almost no one knows about Peshtigo: the Chicago Fire consumed every available column inch of newspaper coverage across the country. Reporters went to Chicago. Editors led with Chicago. The national conversation was about Chicago. Peshtigo, a logging town in Wisconsin whose victims were largely working-class immigrants without political connections, generated a fraction of the coverage of a city that lost far fewer lives. The famous fire ended 300 people. The forgotten fire ended 10 times that many on the same night. Story 7: In August 1975, Typhoon Nina struck central China and produced extraordinary rainfall over the Henan Province watershed. Some stations recorded over 1 meter of rain in 24 hours, exceeding the dam's design parameters by a significant margin. On August 8, the Banqiao Dam and the smaller Shimantan Dam failed in rapid succession. The resulting flood wave hit downstream areas with the force of a released reservoir. The Banqiao Dam alone held approximately 492 million cubic meters of water. When it failed, that water was released downstream in a catastrophic wave that destroyed 62 smaller downstream dams in a cascade, ultimately released approximately 7 billion cubic meters of water across Henan Province, and created a temporary lake the size of a small country. The downstream areas, densely populated agricultural region, had received warning of the flood, but the warnings were inadequate. Communications were disrupted by the typhoon, and the scale of what was coming was not understood. 11 cities and dozens of counties were affected. The immediate flood deaths are estimated at approximately 26,000. The deaths from subsequent disease, displacement, and famine in the following months bring the total to approximately 145,000 to 171,000. The Chinese government did not announce the disaster to the international community. Information was tightly controlled internally. The dam failure was a consequence of decisions made during the Great Leap Forward era of infrastructure construction, when political enthusiasm had driven dam construction without adequate engineering oversight. The Soviet engineer who had designed Banqiao had reportedly warned that the dam was unsafe before construction was complete. The Banqiao disaster was not publicly acknowledged in detail until the 1990s. It remains the deadliest dam failure in history. Story 8: The Netherlands Catastrophe. The Soviet Union's worst space disaster was kept secret for 30 years on October 24, 1960. A Soviet R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile exploded on its launch pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome during a rushed pre-launch test. Chief Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, the commander of Soviet strategic rocket forces, was watching the test from a position dangerously close to the pad when the missile's second-stage engines ignited unexpectedly. The resulting explosion and fire ended approximately 100 to 150 people, including Nedelin, engineers, technicians, and military officers who had been standing near the missile to watch the test. The circumstances that produced the disaster were specific. The deadline pressure of the Cold War space and missile race had driven decision-makers to rush procedures that should have been conducted more carefully. Standard safety protocols requiring evacuation before propellant loading were not followed. When problems were encountered during the countdown, engineers worked on a fully fueled missile rather than standing down and draining it first. Nedelin himself was present at an unsafe distance. Some accounts suggest he was sitting in a chair near the pad, which had the effect of pressuring subordinates not to request the more cautious procedures that would have required his departure. The Soviet government officially reported Nedelin's death as a plane crash. The disaster itself was not acknowledged publicly. Within the closed Soviet space and missile program, the accident was known, but detailed discussion of it was suppressed. Survivors were sworn to secrecy. The disaster was not officially acknowledged until 1989 under Gorbachev's glasnost policy. October 24 subsequently became a day of mourning in the Russian space program, on which launch activities are traditionally suspended. The Cosmodrome's annual memorial observances have been held since the Soviet collapse, at a site where for 30 years officially nothing had happened. Story 9: On January 30th, 1945, the German passenger liner Wilhelm Gustloff was sailing through the Baltic Sea, carrying refugees from the eastern German provinces fleeing the advancing Soviet Red Army, along with wounded soldiers, military personnel, and naval crew. The ship was dangerously overcrowded, estimated at approximately 10,600 people aboard, compared to its peacetime capacity of around 900. Shortly after 9 p.m., Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, fired 3 torpedoes. All 3 hit. The Wilhelm Gustloff, in freezing Baltic water in late January, with insufficient lifeboats and thousands of passengers in a state of panic, sank in approximately 45 to 65 minutes. An estimated 9,000 to 9,400 people died, the largest loss of life in a single maritime disaster in recorded history. The Titanic sank with 1,517 deaths. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank with roughly 6 times that many. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff has never entered the popular disaster mythology for complicated historical reasons. The victims were mostly German civilians, women, children, elderly people fleeing the eastern territories. But the context of the disaster was the final months of a war that Germany had started and prosecuted with extraordinary brutality. The Soviet submarine that sank the ship was performing a legitimate act of war. The moral framing of 9,000 German civilian deaths at the hands of Soviet forces in 1945 was not something that fit neatly into the post-war narrative in either West Germany, East Germany, or the Soviet Union. In Germany, the tragedy was adopted by nationalist groups in ways that made mainstream discussion of it politically uncomfortable. In the Soviet Union, Marinesko's action was treated as a military success. The 9,000 people who drowned were largely left without a comfortable place in anyone's history. Story 10: The Sultana Disaster. 1,800 people died on the Mississippi, and nobody noticed because Lincoln had just been shot on April 27, 1865. The Mississippi River steamboat, Sultana, was traveling north from Vicksburg, carrying recently released Union prisoners of war. men who had survived Confederate prison camps like Andersonville, some of them barely alive, finally heading home after the war's end. The ship's legal capacity was 376 people. The Army had loaded approximately 2,137 soldiers aboard, plus crew and civilian passengers, in an orgy of profitable overcrowding facilitated by corruption in the Army's transportation procurement. At approximately 2 a.m., 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers exploded. The ship, packed with sleeping soldiers, was instantly converted into a burning wreck in the middle of the Mississippi River. Men who survived the explosion jumped into the river. Many drowned because they were too weak from imprisonment to swim, or because the cold water ended them, or because the current was too strong. The burning wreck drifted downstream. Rescuers from Memphis recovered survivors throughout the night and morning. The death toll was approximately 1,800 people, the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. These were soldiers who had survived years of brutal imprisonment in Confederate camps, who had lived through the war, who were going home. They died on a boat with broken boilers, overloaded through corruption on the Mississippi River. The Sultana sank 12 days after Abraham Lincoln was shot. The country's press was consumed by Lincoln's assassination, the subsequent trial of the conspirators, and the search for John Wilkes Booth. The deaths of 1,800 soldiers on the Mississippi were reported and then immediately buried under the weight of the larger story. The men who died had no famous names attached to them and no dramatic narrative that could compete. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. Most Americans have never heard of it. Story 11, the General Slocum disaster. 1,000 people died in New York Harbor, and the city moved on June 15, 1904. The steamboat General Slocum departed from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, carrying approximately 1,358 passengers on an annual church excursion, largely women and children from St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, which served the German immigrant community of Kleindeutschland, the neighborhood in Lower Manhattan that housed New York's largest German-American population. Fire broke out shortly after departure. The crew's response was catastrophically inadequate. The firefighting equipment was rotted and useless. The life preservers were so old and degraded that they crumbled or failed to provide buoyancy, and the captain made the decision to continue towards a destination rather than beaching the ship immediately to allow passengers to escape. By the time he did bring the burning ship to shore at North Brother Island, the fire had been burning for long enough that over 1,000 people were dead. 1,021 confirmed fatalities, making it the deadliest disaster in New York City history until September 11, 2001. The specific quality of the General Slocum disaster that helps explain why it's not better remembered is that it effectively wiped out the community whose tragedy it was. Kleindeutschland lost hundreds of its women and children in a single afternoon. The men who came home from work that evening found their families gone. The community never recovered demographically or psychologically. Within a decade, Kleindeutschland had dissolved. The survivors moved away, the community dispersed, and the neighborhood that had been the center of New York's German-American life ceased to exist as a coherent community. A tragedy that destroys its own witnesses and community of mourners leaves less trace than one with a surviving population to maintain its memory. Story 12, the Iroquois Theater fire. 602 people died in a fireproof building that was open less than 5 weeks. The Iroquois Theater in Chicago opened on November 23, 1903. It was advertised as absolutely fireproof in its promotional materials, a claim made with some justification, since the building featured extensive steel framing, fireproof curtains, and other structural fire safety features. The theater was beautiful, modern, and considered state-of-the-art. On December 30, 1903, 37 days after opening, a fire started backstage during a performance attended by approximately 9,900 people, mostly women and children, at a holiday matinee. The fire spread rapidly, because the asbestos fireproof curtain, designed to separate the stage from the audience, failed to lower properly. It snagged on a light wire partway down and stopped. The ventilation system, designed to exhaust smoke and fire from the stage, instead pulled air from the audience and fed oxygen to the fire. The fire exit doors were equipped with European-style bascule locks that the crowd, unfamiliar with them, could not operate quickly. Some exit doors opened inward, jamming under the pressure of panicking crowds. Some exits led to stairwells with no exits to the street. 602 people died, still the deadliest single-building fire in American history. The cause of death for many was not burns, but asphyxiation, trampling, and falling. People crushed against the jammed doors or piled in stairwells trying to escape a fire that the fireproof building had not actually contained. The Iroquois Theater fire directly produced fire safety regulations, requiring outward opening exit doors equipped with panic bars. The push bar exit doors present in essentially every public building in the world today. The next time you push open a fire exit bar, you are using technology that was invented in response to people dying against locked doors in a Chicago theater in 1903. Story 13, the Coconut Grove Fire. 492 people died in 15 minutes, and it changed fire safety forever on November 28, 1942. Thanksgiving weekend, when the club was packed with soldiers on leave, a fire started in the Melody Lounge basement of the Coconut Grove nightclub in Boston. The cause was probably a match lit by a busboy trying to replace a light bulb. Within approximately 15 minutes, 492 people were dead. The Coconut Grove was a popular club designed for a different era's fire safety standards, which is to say, almost none. The decorations were artificial palm trees and fabric ceiling hangings, extraordinarily flammable materials. The club had been designed to make escape difficult. There were few exits, and the main revolving door quickly jammed with panicking bodies. A door to a side street was locked. Interior doors were hidden by decorative curtains. In the darkness and smoke, people who knew the building couldn't find exits. People who didn't know it had no chance at all. The medical response to the Coconut Grove fire produced innovations that have saved millions of lives in the decades since. Boston City Hospital received hundreds of burn victims in a single night and had to develop new approaches to burn treatment in real time. Improvements in fluid resuscitation, infection control, and skin grafting for burn patients. The Coconut Grove fire is considered one of the formative events of modern burn medicine. Fire safety reform followed immediately. Occupancy limits, mandatory fire exits, panic bar requirements, flammable decoration restrictions, and exit sign requirements all developed from the Coconut Grove disaster and similar events of the era. 492 people died in 15 minutes. The club that ended them had a maximum legal occupancy of 460 and was serving approximately 1,000 people that night. Story 14, the Bengal famine of 1943. 3 million people died in British India, and policy decisions made it worse between 1943 and 1944. An estimated 2 to 3 million people died in Bengal, the eastern province of British-controlled India that today comprises West Bengal and Bangladesh. The famine occurred not because Bengal had insufficient food overall, but because of a confluence of factors including a rice crop disease, wartime disruption of supply chains, inflation that drove food prices beyond the reach of the poor, and specific policy decisions made by the British administration that historians continue to debate and argue over. The most contentious aspect of the historical discussion involves Churchill's war cabinet. Grain exports from India to Britain continued during the famine. Requests from the Indian colonial administration for food aid were made to London. They were either delayed, reduced, or denied. Churchill made statements about Indians that reflected, at minimum, deep indifference to Indian deaths. The Australian government offered to ship wheat to India. The shipment was blocked by Britain. The specific degree to which British wartime policy choices, made knowingly in the context of the famine, contributed to or extended the death toll is a question that historians have argued about for decades, with recent scholarship led by Madhusray Mukherjee and others moving towards stronger conclusions about the policy dimension. The famine of 1943 is barely taught in British schools. It is not a prominent part of the British national memory of World War II. The figures involved, 2 to 3 million people, in a province the British administered, are of a scale that would, in other contexts, generate significant historical attention. In 1971, during Bangladesh's independence war, the Indian government's decision to intervene militarily against Pakistan was shaped in part by awareness of what indifference to Bengali suffering had cost before. Story 15: The Great Chinese Famine. 30 to 55 million people died, and the government didn't admit it for decades between 1959 and 1961. China experienced a famine that ended an estimated 15 to 55 million people. The range of estimates itself reflecting how difficult the Chinese government made it for researchers to establish the true scale. The death toll commonly cited by historians who have been able to examine the data is in the range of 30 to 45 million. For reference, the entire death toll of World War II across all countries and all causes is estimated at approximately 70 to 85 million. China's famine of 3 years may have ended nearly half that many people. The famine was not primarily a natural disaster. It was the consequence of the Great Leap Forward, Mao Zedong's 1958 policy program that attempted to rapidly transform China's agricultural and industrial economy through mass mobilization. Agricultural policies including the abolition of private farming, collectivization, and the diversion of rural labor to backyard steel production reduced the food supply dramatically. Simultaneously, local officials falsified grain production statistics, reporting enormous harvests to meet political quotas. Based on the false statistics, grain was exported, and state stores were maintained even as rural populations were starving. Officials who reported food shortages or requested relief were subject to political punishment. Peasants who were caught leaving collective farms in search of food could be arrested. The information control was so complete that the full scale of what was happening was not visible to the central government in Beijing, or, if it was visible, was not acted upon. The famine was not publicly acknowledged by the Chinese government as a policy failure until the 1980s, and even then in limited terms. The full scope of the demographic data was not accessible to independent researchers until the 1980s and 1990s. 30 million is the approximate population of Canada. Story 16: The Bath School Disaster. A man bombed an elementary school in 1927 and ended 38 children, and almost nobody knows on May 18, 1927, in Bath Township, Michigan. A 55-year-old school board treasurer named Andrew Kehoe detonated explosives he had secretly planted in the basement of the Bath Consolidated School, killing 36 children and 2 teachers. He had been planting the explosives for months, having secretly acquired 500 pounds of pyritol and dynamite during his time maintaining the school building in his role as a local official and handyman. The morning of May 18, Kehoe first ended his wife and set fire to his farm buildings. At 8:45 a.m., the school exploded. Rescue workers rushed to the scene to help the surviving children trapped in the rubble. At 9:45 a.m., as the superintendent of schools and other officials were gathered near the destroyed north wing, Kehoe drove his truck, which he had packed with metal shrapnel and additional explosives, to the site and detonated it. The secondary explosion ended the superintendent, a postmaster, a retired farmer, and 2 bystanders, as well as Kehoe himself. Investigators then discovered that Kehoe had wired the entire south wing of the school with additional explosives that had failed to detonate. If the south wing charge had fired, the death toll would have been far higher. The Bath School disaster is the deadliest act of mass murder at a school in American history. It ended 38 children and 6 adults. The Columbine High School shooting in 1999, which is remembered as a watershed moment in American school violence awareness, ended 15 people. The reason the Bath School disaster is not remembered with similar cultural weight is straightforward. 4 days later, Charles Lindbergh took off from New York in the spirit of St. Louis on his transatlantic flight to Paris. Lindbergh's landing in Paris consumed the American press entirely. A man bombed an elementary school and ended 38 children. Lindbergh flew a plane, and the bombing was forgotten. Story 17, the Elaine Massacre. Federal troops helped end over 100 black sharecroppers in Arkansas in 1919. In late September and early October of 1919, in Phillips County, Arkansas, violence erupted when white law enforcement officers and armed white civilians attacked a meeting of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, a black sharecroppers union organizing for fair cotton prices and the right to examine the plantation ledgers that determined how much they were paid. The specific account of what happened varies depending on the source. What is agreed, fighting broke out at the union meeting on the night of September 30, killing one white law enforcement officer and wounding another. The response was a wave of violence by white mobs, supplemented by 500 federal troops dispatched by the governor of Arkansas, that ended an estimated 100 to 240 black sharecroppers and their family members over the following days. 5 white men were also killed. Hundreds of black residents were arrested. 12 black men were sentenced to death. Approximately 67 more were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The prosecution of the black prisoners, in trials lasting less than 10 minutes before all white juries with no meaningful legal representation, was eventually challenged through the NAACP and ultimately reached the Supreme Court in Moore v. Dempsey, which established the precedent that federal courts could review state criminal convictions that had violated due process. The Elaine Massacre is sometimes called the deadliest incident of racial violence in American history. The specific death toll is uncertain because most of the ended were black sharecroppers, whose deaths were not systematically counted by the authorities that facilitated them. The event is not in most American history curricula. The 12 black men sentenced to death were eventually freed. The people who ended hundreds of sharecroppers were not charged. Story 18, the Herero and Nama genocide. Germany's first genocide ended tens of thousands in Namibia and is just now being acknowledged between 1904 and 1908. German colonial forces in German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, conducted a campaign against the Herero and Nama peoples that historians increasingly classify as the first genocide of the 20th century. The Herero uprising against German colonial rule in January 1904 prompted a response under General Lothar von Trotha that escalated from military suppression to explicit extermination. Von Trotha issued the Vernichtungsbefehl, the extermination order, in October 1904, declaring that every Herero within German-controlled territory, whether armed or not, would be shot. Those who fled into the Omaheke Desert were prevented from returning to water sources, herded further into the desert by German lines, and left to die of thirst. An estimated 80% of the Herero population, approximately 65,000 people, died. The Nama people, who subsequently rose in resistance, suffered proportionally similar losses. The survivors were interned in concentration camps, Konzentrationslager, a term the German colonial administration used, where they were used as forced labor and subjected to conditions that produced very high mortality rates. Some were used as subjects in medical experiments. The camp records and death statistics were maintained by German administrators. Germany acknowledged the events as genocide in 2021 and agreed to provide $1.1 billion in development funding to Namibia over 30 years, explicitly declining, however, to frame the payments as reparations in a legal sense. This distinction matters to the Herero and Nama descendants who brought pressure for decades to achieve even this partial recognition. The genocide is rarely taught outside Germany and Namibia. The terminology, the scale, and the specific mechanisms prefigured what happened in Europe 30 years later in ways that historians have not ignored, even if popular education has. Story 19, the Tri-State Tornado of 1925. One storm ended 695 people across 3 states and lasted 3.5 hours on March 18, 1925. A tornado, possibly the same continuous funnel throughout, possibly several connected funnels, traveled approximately 219 miles across Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana over approximately 3.5 hours, killing 695 people and injuring over 2,000 more. It is the deadliest tornado in American history. No tornado before or since has approached its death toll. Several factors combined to make the 1925 tornado so lethal. The storm moved at approximately 60 to 70 miles per hour, extraordinarily fast for a tornado, which gave communities almost no warning and left little time to take shelter. There was no modern radar, no National Weather Service tornado warning system, and no standardized warning dissemination infrastructure. People received no official warning at all. Local awareness came only from seeing or hearing the storm directly. The tornado struck during the afternoon on a weekday, when schools were in session. In Murfreesboro, Illinois alone, 613 people were ended, including students in multiple schools that collapsed directly on the children inside. The community of DeSoto, Illinois, lost 69 of its approximately 600 residents. The mining town of West Frankfort, Illinois, lost 148 people. The tornado moved through each community so quickly that rescue could not reach some areas before the storm had moved on to the next. The specific absence of warning systems meant that for many communities, there was no intermediate experience between normal daily life and catastrophe. Witnesses described entire streets of houses disappearing in seconds, people being carried hundreds of feet and surviving or dying, depending on where they landed. Modern tornado warning systems, the sirens, the radar, the Doppler tracking, the severe weather alerts, were developed in the decades following 1925 in explicit response to tragedies like this one. The 695 deaths of the tri-state tornado helped build the infrastructure that has saved thousands of lives since. Story 20: The Halifax Explosion of 1917. The biggest man-made explosion in history before the atomic bomb. On the morning of December 6, 1917, a French cargo ship called the Mont Blanc, loaded with 2,925 tons of explosives, including TNT, wet picric acid, gun cotton, and barrels of benzol on deck, collided with a Norwegian vessel called the Emo in the narrows of Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia. The collision caused a fire. A fire on a ship loaded with wartime explosives was not something the harbor could survive. At 9:04:35 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. The explosion was the largest man-made explosion in history before the first nuclear weapon. The blast wave was detected as far as 290 miles away. Windows were broken at a distance of 60 miles, and the explosion was heard across Nova Scotia and into Prince Edward Island. The resulting shockwave, fires, and tsunami from the harbor water displacement ended approximately 2,000 people and injured approximately 9,000 more. Approximately 1,600 buildings were completely destroyed, and 12,000 more were damaged. 1 in 5 residents of Halifax suffered injuries. The immediate aftermath included a blizzard that struck the city the following day, hampering rescue operations and killing additional survivors who might otherwise have been reached in time. The Halifax explosion prompted immediate international aid, including significant assistance from Boston and from Massachusetts, an act that has been credited with the long-standing relationship between Halifax and Boston, expressed to this day in Halifax's annual donation of a large Christmas tree to Boston, placed in Boston Common as a thank you for the 1917 aid. 2,000 people died in a single instant in a Canadian city during World War I, producing the largest pre-nuclear explosion in history. It is not a well-known event outside Canada. Story 21: The Empress of Ireland. A ship sank in 14 minutes in 1914, and the news was buried under WWI on May 29, 1914. The Canadian Pacific Ocean liner Empress of Ireland was sailing down the St. Lawrence River toward the Atlantic when a Norwegian collier called the Storstad emerged from a dense fog bank and struck the Empress amidships. The Empress's port side, where the collision occurred, was immediately open to the river. The ship's boilers, briefly continuing to operate with water flooding the engine rooms, produced a brief catastrophic list. The ship sank in 14 minutes. 1,012 people died. 465 survived. The death toll was close enough to the Titanic's 517 that the Empress of Ireland might have become an equally iconic maritime disaster, except for timing. The Empress of Ireland sank on May 29, 1914. On June 28, 1914, 30 days later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Europe was at war. The Empress of Ireland's death toll was immediately buried under the news of a world going to war. By the time the first months of World War I had established themselves as the dominant story of the era, the Empress disaster was already fading from public consciousness. The war that would end approximately 20 million people made 1,012 deaths in a river collision seem like a footnote even within the year it happened. The Empress of Ireland lies in the St. Lawrence today in approximately 40 meters of water and is accessible to recreational divers. It is one of Canada's most significant shipwrecks and one of the most accessible for divers willing to make the trip to Quebec's lower St. Lawrence region. Outside Canada, almost no one knows it sank. Story 22: The SS Leopoldville. 800 American soldiers drowned on Christmas Eve, miles from shore. And it was suppressed for decades on December 24, 1944. Christmas Eve, the Belgian troopship SS Leopoldville was carrying 2,235 American soldiers of the 66th Infantry Division across the English Channel toward Cherbourg, France, as part of the Allied response to the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The ship was approximately 5 miles from shore when a German U-boat torpedo struck it. The torpedo hit, but did not sink the ship immediately. There was time, perhaps 45 minutes to an hour, between the torpedo strike and the Leopoldville's sinking. The rescue operation that should have saved most of the soldiers was catastrophically mismanaged. Communications failures meant that some nearby ships were not immediately alerted. The Belgian crew's response was disorganized. The soldiers, many of whom spoke no French, could not communicate with the Belgian crew. The ship's lights were not lit to guide rescuers. British and American ships did eventually arrive and saved many soldiers, but the chaos and delay meant that when the Leopoldville finally sank, hundreds of soldiers went down with it. Over 800 soldiers died, many within sight of the French coast, on Christmas Eve. The U.S. and Belgian militaries suppressed information about the disaster for over 40 years. The official explanation was wartime security, avoiding giving Germany information about the convoy's disruption. Whether the suppression was extended to conceal the extent of the rescue failures is a question that has occupied the survivors and their families. Survivors were ordered not to discuss the sinking. The story remained largely unknown until the 1990s, when surviving veterans began speaking publicly and researchers published accounts of the disaster. The men who died on Christmas Eve within sight of the French shore have no prominent memorial. Story 23: The Ludlow Massacre. The Colorado National Guard set fire to a striking miners' camp and children died in a pit-on April 20, 1914, Easter Monday. Members of the Colorado National Guard and company guards employed by Rockefeller-owned Colorado Fuel and Iron Company attacked a tent colony of approximately 1,200 striking coal miners and their families at Ludlow, Colorado. The attackers opened fire on the colony with rifles and a machine gun mounted on an armored vehicle. During the attack and the subsequent fire, women and children sheltered in pits dug beneath some of the tents. When the tents above them caught fire, the pits became traps. The following day, rescuers found the bodies of 2 women and 11 children who had suffocated or burned in one such pit, a discovery that became the defining image of the massacre. Total deaths at Ludlow are estimated at approximately 21, including the women and children in the pit, adult miners, and members of the National Guard. The attack triggered what became known as the 10 Days War, in which armed miners seized a significant portion of southern Colorado and fought the National Guard in open combat until President Wilson sent in federal troops. The Ludlow Massacre is a pivotal event in American labor history. It contributed to public pressure for federal labor regulations and became a symbol of the cost of organizing for workers' rights. It is also almost entirely absent from mainstream American history education. The names of the children who died in the pit are Elvira Valdez, Rudolph Valdez, Patria Valdez, Mary Valdez, Frank Petrucci, Joe Petrucci, Lucy Petrucci, Lucy Costa, Onofrio Costa, Rogerino Pedregoni, and Clariva Pedregoni. A Rockefeller family representative subsequently published materials blaming the deaths on the miners. Story 24, the Tangshan earthquake, one of the deadliest earthquakes ever, and China refused international help at 3:42 am on July 28, 1976. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake struck Tangshan, a city of approximately 1 million people in northeastern China, with virtually no warning. The earthquake was shallow, the epicenter was close to the surface, and struck while the city's population was sleeping. The combination of a dense, heavily built urban area, a shallow focus earthquake, and a population asleep in their homes produced catastrophic casualties. The official Chinese death toll, published in 1979, was 242,769. Independent estimates by seismologists and demographers have suggested the actual toll may have been between 400,000 and 650,000 people. If the higher estimates are accurate, Tangshan would rank alongside the 1556 Shaanxi earthquake as one of the 2 or 3 deadliest earthquakes in recorded history. The Chinese government under Hua Guofeng declined offers of international aid, consistent with China's post-Cultural Revolution political posture of self-reliance and reluctance to acknowledge weakness or need to foreign governments. The death toll figures were not released publicly until 3 years after the earthquake. Foreign journalists were not permitted access. The rescue operation, which involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers and was extraordinarily large by any standard, was documented almost entirely in Chinese language sources that were not widely accessible internationally. 1976 was also the year of Mao Zedong's death and a period of intense political transition in China. The earthquake, which occurred approximately 6 weeks before Mao's death, was interpreted by some Chinese as a portent of the dynasty's change, a traditional cultural association between natural disasters and political transformation that was not officially endorsed but was privately widespread. Tangshan was rebuilt. The rebuilt city has a museum to the disaster. The true death toll may never be established. Story 25, the Great Fire of Smyrna, 1922. A city burned and its Greek and Armenian population was destroyed in September 1922. The city of Smyrna, modern Izmir, on the Aegean coast of Turkey, burned in a fire that lasted several days, destroyed the Greek and Armenian quarters of the city, and left hundreds of thousands of people trapped on the waterfront between the burning city and the sea. With Allied warships anchored in the harbor, maintaining a policy of neutrality that effectively meant non-intervention. The events occurred in the context of the final stages of the Greco-Turkish War, in which Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal had defeated the Greek army and were completing their reconquest of western Anatolia. The Greek and Armenian populations of Smyrna, roughly half the city's pre-war population, faced a Turkish military force that had already been associated with massacres and population displacement elsewhere in the war. The fire's origin remains contested between Greek and Turkish accounts. What is agreed is that the fire burned the Greek and Armenian quarters while the Turkish quarter was largely spared. Allied warships of the British, American, French, and Italian navies were present in the harbor throughout. Their orders prioritized neutrality in the Turkish-Greek conflict, and initial orders prevented them from embarking refugees fleeing the fire to the waterfront. The spectacle of hundreds of thousands of people burning or drowning within sight of Allied naval vessels was eventually too much. Ships eventually began taking on refugees, and a subsequent Allied evacuation extracted perhaps 200,000 people. The death toll is disputed and politically charged, Estimates range from tens of thousands to several hundred thousand. The destruction of the cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic Ottoman port city of Smyrna and the displacement of its Greek and Armenian populations has been given different names and different frames by different national histories. Story 26, the Sappho, the Assyrian genocide, happened alongside the Armenian genocide and is almost entirely unknown, the Armenian genocide of 1915-1923, the systematic mass killing and deportation of the Armenian Christian population of the Ottoman Empire, estimated to have ended approximately 600,000 to 1.5 million people, is among the most widely recognized genocides of the 20th century and the subject of ongoing international recognition debates. Occurring simultaneously in the same geographic area under the same Ottoman government and military was the Sappho, the Syriac word for sword, the genocide of the Assyrian and Syriac Christian populations of the Ottoman Empire and Persian territory. Estimates of the Assyrian death toll range from 250,000 to 750,000, perhaps half the total Assyrian population of the region. The Sappho also included the mass killing of Syriac Orthodox, Syriac Catholic, and other Syriac Christian denominations, and is sometimes discussed alongside the simultaneous Pontic Greek massacres as part of a broader Ottoman campaign against Christian minority populations. The Sappho has received a fraction of the recognition of the Armenian genocide, which is itself still not recognized by Turkey and remains controversial in international diplomatic contexts. The reasons for the differential recognition are complex. The Armenian diaspora is larger and has been more effectively organized for advocacy. Armenians have a recognized homeland state, and the Armenian case was more extensively documented by American and European diplomats at the time. Assyrian communities scattered across Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, the United States, and Europe have been advocating for recognition of the Sappho for decades. A small number of countries formally recognize it. Most do not. The people who died in it are not in most curricula anywhere, including in many of the countries whose governments have recognized the concurrent Armenian genocide. Story 27, the Vajant Dam disaster. Engineers warned about the mountain. Nobody listened. 2,000 people died on October 9, 1963. Approximately 260 million cubic meters of rock, a section of Monte Toc in the Italian Dolomites, slid into the reservoir behind the Vajant Dam in northeastern Italy. The landslide was so enormous and so fast that it displaced the reservoir water in a wave that overtopped the 262-meter-high dam and sent a wall of water down the valley below, destroying the towns of Longarone, Parago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Fa, and killing approximately 1,900 to 2,500 people. The dam itself survived the event structurally intact, an extraordinary engineering achievement, or alternatively an extraordinary irony, depending on how you look at it. The dam withstood the force of 260 million cubic meters of rock landing in its reservoir and the resulting wave. The valley below did not withstand what the dam survived. The specific tragedy of Vajant is that multiple warnings had been issued before the disaster. Geological surveys conducted during dam construction had identified instability in the Monte Toc slope. Test fillings of the reservoir in the late 1950s had produced small landslides, which were observed and studied. Researchers had warned that the slope above the reservoir was unstable, and that filling the reservoir to full capacity risked triggering a major slide. The dam operators had gradually raised the water level anyway, prioritizing the dam's operational capacity. In the weeks before the disaster, warning signs were acute enough that some residents of the immediate lakeside had been evacuated. The towns of Longarone and the other downstream communities were not evacuated, because the risk to them from a wave overtopping the dam was apparently not fully grasped. Italian courts subsequently convicted the managers of the dam operating company and others of criminal negligence resulting in death. The warnings had been made. The decisions had been made differently. Story 28, the Aberfan disaster. A coal tip collapsed onto a school, and ended 116 children in Wales on the morning of October 21st, 1966. A coal tip, a spoil heap of mining waste, above the village of Aberfan in South Wales, became unstable after days of heavy rain and began to slide down the hillside. The slide gathered speed and mass as it moved, incorporating other tips and debris, and reached Pontglas Junior School at approximately 9:15 am, just after the start of the school day. The slide engulfed the school. It also destroyed a row of houses. When the movement stopped, the school and 20 houses were buried under approximately 10 meters of coal slurry. The immediate response was a rescue effort involving miners, emergency services, and volunteers from across Wales and beyond, digging by hand through the debris to find survivors. 144 people died, 116 children, and 28 adults. Almost all the victims from the school had been in classrooms at the front of the building, which bore the full force of the slide. Classrooms at the rear of the school survived. The inquiry that followed, led by Lord Justice Edmund Davies, found that the National Coal Board had known the tip was positioned above springs, that the ground beneath it was unstable, and that warnings about the danger had been raised and not acted upon. Lord Robins, the chairman of the National Coal Board, initially attempted to claim that the disaster was unforeseeable. The inquiry explicitly rejected this finding and determined the coal board had been negligent. The Aberfan disaster prompted changes to spoil heap regulation in Britain and is deeply embedded in Welsh cultural memory. In an international context, it is relatively unknown. A tragedy that ended 116 children in a village that most of the world has never heard of. Story 29: The Xhosa Cattle Killing. A prophecy convinced a people to destroy everything they had in April 1856. A 15-year-old Xhosa girl named Nonkavi reported visions near a river in what is now the eastern Cape of South Africa. The visions told her that the Xhosa ancestors would rise from the dead, that the British colonists would be driven into the sea, and that the Xhosa would live in a paradise of plenty, but only if the Xhosa fulfilled a condition. They had to end all their cattle and destroy all their grain stores. Only by destroying everything they had, the prophecy said, would they receive everything they were promised. The prophecy arrived in a period of profound Xhosa vulnerability. A lung disease was killing cattle across the region. Military defeats had weakened Xhosa sovereignty, and colonial pressure on Xhosa land was intensifying. The prophecy spread. Different Xhosa leaders and communities responded differently, with some fully committed to killing cattle and others refusing. The Xhosa paramount chief Sarhili ultimately supported the movement. Over the following months, the Xhosa ended an estimated 400,000 cattle and destroyed their grain stores. The prophesied resurrection did not occur. The prophesied paradise did not arrive. The consequences were catastrophic famine. An estimated 40,000 to 50,000 Xhosa died of starvation in the following months. Another 40,000 abandoned the area in search of food, many accepting work as laborers in the Cape Colony. The Xhosa population in the affected region was reduced by approximately 2/3. The British colonial governor, Sir George Grey, responded to the famine by distributing limited food aid in exchange for labor, conditions that strengthened British control over the region. The cattle-killing movement, whether or not it was encouraged or manipulated by British interests, produced the collapse of Xhosa independence far more completely than military defeat had. Story 30: Between 1876 and 1878, drought conditions across southern and western India produced crop failures that created famine conditions affecting millions of people. The Madras and Bombay presidencies were worst affected. The death toll is estimated at between 5 and 8 million people, with some estimates considerably higher. The specific historical controversy surrounding the 1876-1878 famine is the role of British colonial policy in determining its severity. The Viceroy, Lord Lytton, was ideologically committed to non-interference in the grain market. He believed that government intervention in food distribution would create perverse incentives, and that market mechanisms would efficiently distribute grain to those who needed it. Relief works were established, but kept deliberately inadequate, with wages set low enough that laborers would only seek them as a last resort. During the famine, India continued to export grain to Britain. In 1877, a peak famine year, approximately 6.4 million hundredweight of wheat were exported from India to Britain. The decision not to halt exports or divert grain to famine relief while millions were dying was a policy choice made by colonial administrators under a specific economic ideology. The 1876-1878 famine was followed by another major Indian famine in 1899-1902. The British response to the famines prompted a sustained critique from journalist and writer William Digby, who published detailed accounts of the famines and their policy dimensions. Economist Amartya Sen, in his later work on famine, argued that democratic political systems with free press create accountability that prevents governments from ignoring famines, an argument implicitly addressing the colonial context in which Indian famines occurred without the accountability mechanisms that might have produced different policy responses. Story 31, between 1888 and 1892, Ethiopia and the surrounding Horn of Africa region experienced a catastrophe that combined cattle disease, drought, smallpox, and military devastation in a cascade that ended an estimated 1/3 of Ethiopia's entire population. In absolute terms, the death toll is estimated at 3 to 5 million people from a country of approximately 9 million. The specific initial trigger was the arrival of rinderpest, a catastrophic cattle disease in the Horn of Africa around 1888, introduced through livestock brought in to feed Italian colonial troops. Rinderpest ended approximately 90% of cattle across Ethiopia and the surrounding regions. The cattle represented not just food, but agricultural labor, transport, and capital. When they died, the agricultural system that depended on them largely collapsed. Crops could not be plowed or harvested effectively. Rinderpest spread across Africa from East Africa to West Africa and South Africa over the following years, in what is considered one of the greatest ecological catastrophes in the continent's recorded history, killing livestock across an enormous area and fundamentally disrupting the agricultural economies of dozens of African societies. In Ethiopia specifically, the cattle deaths coincided with drought, with a smallpox epidemic, and with military campaigns by both Ethiopian forces and Italian colonial forces in the border regions. The combination of agricultural collapse, epidemic disease, and military displacement produced the particular devastation of the Ethiopian Great Famine. Emperor Menelik II, who led Ethiopia through this period and in 1896 defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa, in the first significant African military defeat of a European colonial power, is celebrated in Ethiopian history as a great ruler. The famine of his reign, which ended perhaps 1/3 of his subjects, is less prominent in the celebration. Story 32 on March 4, 1908. A fire started near a staircase at the Lakeview Elementary School in the Collinwood neighborhood of Cleveland, Ohio, during the school day. The fire was noticed quickly. Evacuation procedures were initiated promptly, and the children began moving toward the exits in an orderly fashion. And then the doors jammed. The main exit doors of Lakeview Elementary opened inward into the building. As children rushed toward the doors and the crowd compressed behind them, the pressure of dozens of children pressing forward against the doors made them impossible to open. The children trying to open the doors were being pushed against them by the crowd behind them. Teachers who tried to reach the doors could not get through the crush. By the time adults managed to open the doors from outside, or to break through them, the fire had overtaken the stairwells and the children closest to the doors. 172 children died. The fire that ended them had been manageable. The building that ended them had doors that opened the wrong way. The Collinwood school fire prompted immediate changes to school building codes, particularly the requirement that exterior exit doors open outward, the same requirement that applies to essentially all public buildings today. It was a technological and regulatory lesson paid for with the lives of 172 children in Cleveland. The fire is almost entirely absent from popular memory. It appears in fire safety history and in discussions of building code development. The children who died, whose photographs survive in the Cleveland City archives, are not in any curriculum and have no significant public memorial beyond a marker in Collinwood. The doors open outward in your school because of Collinwood. Story 33 on December 7, 1946, Pearl Harbor Day. 5 years after the attack, a fire broke out in the Weinkauf Hotel in Atlanta, Georgia. The Weinkauf was a 15-story building completed in 1913 and advertised as absolutely fireproof, a claim that referred to its steel and concrete construction and was, in a narrow structural sense, accurate. The building itself did not burn significantly. What the building lacked was fire escapes. The Weinkauf had been built before fire escape requirements were codified in Atlanta building regulations. It had no sprinkler system. It had a single internal stairwell. The fire started on the 3rd or 4th floor, probably from a smoldering mattress, and the stairwell functioned as a chimney, drawing heat and smoke upward through all 15 floors. Guests on upper floors who opened their doors to the hall were immediately overcome by smoke. Those who stayed in their rooms faced a choice between smoke inhalation and jumping. 119 people died, still the deadliest hotel fire in American history. Among the dead were 30 people who jumped or fell from windows. Others died of smoke inhalation in their rooms or in the corridor. The hotel's guests included people attending conventions and a large number of military personnel on holiday travel. The Weinkauf fire, along with other hotel and nightclub fires of the era, drove the development of modern hotel fire safety requirements, sprinkler systems, multiple stairwells, enclosed stairwells, smoke detectors, marked fire exits, and fire suppression systems. These requirements, now standard in hotels across most of the world, trace directly to disasters like Weinkauf and Coconut Grove. The building still stands in Atlanta. It has been converted to apartments. Story 34 on June 11, 1955. During the 24 Hours of Le Mans endurance race, a collision near the pits sent the Mercedes-Benz of Pierre Levay airborne. The car struck an earth embankment, disintegrated, and sent debris, including the engine, bonnet, and suspension components, into a densely packed spectator area. The engine and bonnet became projectiles moving at high speed through a crowd of people who had no time to react. 83 spectators and the driver Pierre Levay died. More than 100 more were injured. The disaster site was directly opposite the pits, in one of the most heavily spectated sections of the circuit. The spectators who died had been standing where spectators always stood at Le Mans, in an area that had never previously been the site of significant injury. The race organizers, race officials, and French authorities made the decision to continue the race. The rationale involved concern that stopping the race would cause the enormous crowd, estimated at 200,000, to attempt to leave simultaneously on roads that were also the emergency routes for ambulances, creating additional casualties. Whether this reasoning was correct, or whether continuing the race while 83 people were dead in the grandstand was defensible, was debated in the hours, days, and years that followed. Mercedes-Benz withdrew from motorsport entirely after Le Mans 1955 and did not return to factory racing for 3 decades. Several countries banned motorsport entirely or partially in the wake of the disaster. Spain, Switzerland, and others enacted or tightened racing prohibitions. The Le Mans disaster produced significant safety redesign of motorsport circuits and regulations over the following decades. The spectators who died were watching a race that continued while they lay dead beside the track. Story 35, we've been through 34 tragedies. 830,000 people dead in an earthquake you've never been taught about. 3 million drowned in a flood that was the deadliest natural disaster in human history. 9,000 refugees drowned on one ship. 38 children ended in a school bombing the same week Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. A lake in Cameroon that quietly suffocated 1,700 sleeping people with gas. A cyclone that helped give birth to a nation. Children who died because the doors opened inward. Every one of these has a reason it's not in the history you were taught. Some were hidden by governments that didn't want the information public. Some were buried by larger news stories that consumed all available attention. Some disappeared because the victims were from communities without the political power or the surviving numbers to keep the memory alive. Some have been suppressed by the specific difficulty of fitting the tragedy into the national narratives that school curricula are designed to reinforce. The disasters that made it into popular memory, the Titanic, the Hindenburg, the San Francisco earthquake, are not necessarily bigger or more significant than the ones that didn't. They had better documentation, better press access, more politically connected victims, or better timing relative to the news cycle. The 1931 China floods ended more people than any other natural disaster in recorded history. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the deadliest maritime disaster in history. The Bath School Massacre ended more children than any school attack in American history. These facts are not obscure because the events were small. They are obscure because the mechanisms that make events memorable are imperfect and unequal. Remembering these things doesn't undo them, but not knowing them means we're navigating the present with a map that's missing most of its territory. The disasters that shaped policy, that built the safety systems we live with, that defined the politics of their moments, they happened whether or not we were taught about them. They happened. Most of us just weren't told. Story 36, the Salang Tunnel disaster. Up to 3,000 people died in an Afghan mountain tunnel, and the war buried the story in November 1982. During the Soviet-Afghan War. A collision inside the Salang Tunnel, a 2.7-kilometer tunnel through the Hindu Kush Mountains at an altitude of approximately 3,400 meters, triggered a fire and a catastrophic buildup of carbon monoxide from vehicle exhaust in the enclosed space. The tunnel was the primary supply route between the Soviet Union and Kabul, and on the day of the disaster, it was packed with Soviet military vehicles and civilian traffic. The specific sequence, a Soviet military fuel truck collided with another vehicle inside the tunnel. The resulting fire and the military's response, sealing the tunnel entrances to contain what they initially believed was an ambush, trapped hundreds of vehicles and their occupants inside. Carbon monoxide from vehicle engines running in the enclosed tunnel built to lethal levels. People died in their vehicles, unable to escape and unaware that the air around them was becoming poisonous. The death toll estimates are extraordinarily wide. Soviet sources initially acknowledged around 64 deaths. Independent estimates, based on the number of vehicles and people known to have been in the tunnel at the time, range as high as 700 to 2,700 deaths, with some estimates reaching 3,000. The wartime secrecy that the Soviet military maintained over all operational matters in Afghanistan made verification impossible during the conflict, and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union meant comprehensive records were never assembled. The Salang Tunnel disaster may be one of the deadliest road traffic accidents in history. It occurred during a war that generated enormous coverage of military operations, and a catastrophic accident on a supply route attributed to military error and response failure, was precisely the kind of story that wartime censorship was designed to prevent from reaching the public. It reached almost no one. The tunnel was repaired and kept in service. The dead have no memorial. Story 37, the Nanjing Massacre's lesser-known parallel. The Sukching Massacre ended 50,000 in Singapore. The Nanjing Massacre of 1937-38. In which Japanese forces ended an estimated 100 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war following the fall of the Chinese capital, is the most internationally recognized Japanese wartime atrocity after Unit 731. Less well known, outside Singapore and Malaysia, is the Sukching, meaning purge through cleansing in Hokkien, which occurred in February and March of 1942. Following Japan's rapid conquest of the Malay Peninsula and Singapore. Following the British surrender of Singapore on February 15, 1942, the Japanese military administration ordered a systematic screening operation to identify and eliminate Chinese males considered threats to Japanese rule, specifically those suspected of anti-Japanese activity, supporters of China's war effort, or those who had contributed to the Malayan campaign funds that had financed the Chinese resistance. The screening was conducted at designated sites where men were processed, and those selected were taken away by truck. The selected men were taken to beaches and remote areas and executed. The operation lasted approximately 2 weeks and ended an estimated 25,000 to 50,000 people. The wide range of estimates reflects both the deliberate concealment of the killings and the difficulty of establishing records for an operation conducted in wartime secrecy. Japan acknowledged the killings in 1962 and made a one-time payment to Singapore, described as blood debt compensation. The specific acknowledgement of the scale and systematic nature of the operation has been more limited in subsequent Japanese historical education than Singaporean advocates have sought. The Sukching is central to Singaporean national memory and identity. It is the reason Singapore has a specific and historically grounded wariness of external military threats, but it is almost entirely absent from international curricula or popular historical knowledge. Story 38, the Hawks Nest Tunnel Disaster. 764 workers died drilling a tunnel in West Virginia, and the company covered it up between 1930 and 1931. Approximately 3,000 workers, the majority of them black migrants from the Deep South, drilled a 2-mile tunnel through Gauley Mountain in West Virginia for Union Carbide's New Kanawha Power Company. The tunnel was designed to divert the New River to a hydroelectric plant. The rock they were drilling through was almost pure silica, among the most hazardous materials a miner can breathe. Silicosis is a fatal lung disease caused by breathing crystalline silica dust. In acute silicosis, which develops from heavy short-term exposure, the lungs fill with fluid and the victim suffocates. The silica content of the Gauley Mountain rock was so high that workers were developing acute silicosis within weeks or months of beginning work. Men who had been healthy when they arrived were dying within a year. The company was aware of the hazard. Silicosis was known and its causes understood in 1930. Workers were not provided with protective equipment. They were not warned. When workers began dying, the company arranged for burials in a field near the tunnel site at $2 per burial to avoid attracting attention. At least 764 workers died from silicosis contracted at the tunnel, and some estimates place the death toll over 1,000. Many of the dead were buried in unmarked or inadequately marked graves. Congressional hearings were held in 1936. The company's attorneys settled individual cases out of court, often for small sums, with non-disclosure requirements. No criminal charges were filed. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster is considered one of the worst industrial disasters in American history and one of the most significant events in the history of occupational safety regulation. Yet, it appears in almost no American history curriculum. Story 39, the Bhopal gas disaster. 15,000 people died, and the CEO was never extradited in the early hours of December 3, 1984. A Union Carbide pesticide plant in Bhopal, India, released approximately 40 tons of methyl isocyanate, an extraordinarily toxic industrial chemical, into the surrounding city. The gas cloud moved through densely populated neighborhoods while residents slept. Those who woke to the smell and the burning sensation in their eyes and lungs had to decide whether to run and in which direction. In darkness, with no warning system, no official guidance, and no knowledge of what they were breathing. The immediate death toll is estimated at 3,787 by the Indian government, and between 8,000 and 15,000 by other analyses that include deaths in the days and weeks following the release. The longer-term death toll from chronic exposure-related illness is estimated by some at 15,000 to 20,000. Approximately 500,000 people were exposed to the gas cloud. Warren Anderson, the chairman and CEO of Union Carbide at the time of the disaster, was arrested in India and released on bail, flew back to the United States, and never returned to India to face trial. India issued an arrest warrant. The United States declined to extradite him. Anderson lived in the United States until his death in 2014. He was never tried for the Bhopal disaster in any jurisdiction. Union Carbide was acquired by Dow Chemical in 2001. Dow has maintained that it has no liability for Bhopal cleanup costs beyond what Union Carbide settled for in 1989, a settlement of $470 million that the Indian Supreme Court subsequently found inadequate. The contamination at the plant site has not been fully remediated. Residents of the area near the plant continue to report elevated rates of illness and birth defects attributable to groundwater contamination from the abandoned facility. Bhopal is the worst industrial accident in history. The accountability has been proportional to none of it. Story 40, the Banqiao floods forgotten downstream. 11 million people were displaced, and a city was erased. The Banqiao Dam failure of 1975, already covered in this collection for its 171,000 deaths, had a specific downstream human dimension that deserves its own examination, because the numbers involved go well beyond the death toll. When the Banqiao and Shimantan dams failed on August 8, 1975, the released water did not simply flow into rivers and drain away. It inundated approximately 30 counties and municipalities across a large area of Henan province. The floodwaters covered an area roughly the size of England with up to 7 meters of water. In this area lived approximately 11 million people. The town of Suping, which sat downstream of the dams, was struck by the initial flood wave with such force that the physical town essentially ceased to exist. Entire villages in the path of the wave were swept away, leaving no buildings, no landmarks, and in many cases no survivors to describe what had happened. The flood wave moved faster than any warning could travel, and in communities directly in the path, there was no warning possible regardless. The 11 million people who were displaced, whose homes, crops, and in many cases families were destroyed, required relief operations on a scale that would have been extraordinary for any government. The Chinese government's response was hampered by the same political dynamics that had produced the dam failures. The Cultural Revolution had created an environment hostile to the kind of careful institutional planning and honest reporting that disaster response requires. Local officials had been reluctant to report the storm's severity upward because of political pressure. The relief operation arrived late and was initially insufficient. The scale of the Banqiao disaster, not just deaths, but the total displacement and destruction across 30 counties, makes it one of the most significant civil disasters of the 20th century. That it occurred in a country whose government suppressed reporting about it meant it happened almost entirely outside the awareness of the rest of the world.